The world is looking ahead to Donald Trump's second term as US president. What can it expect from Trump 2.0? And will his America First policy conflict with the world order created and led by Washington since World War II? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. The first 100 days of Donald Trump's first term were defined by chaos, from banning visitors from some Muslim-majority countries to pulling out of major trade deals. His decisions shocked the world. Trump's actions sought to assert American leadership globally, but they were widely seen as attempts to flaunt power. And instead of earning respect for the US president, they triggered fear. Trump's made similar threats and assertions in the weeks before his second term in office. He's promising to crack down on immigration, unleash tariffs on allies, and even take control of the Panama Canal and Greenland. So what can the international community expect from the second Trump presidency in the next 4 years? And can he halt Washington's fading reputation as an upholder of democracy and a rules-based world order? We'll get to these issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez-Horayan.
Donald Trump's second presidential term begins in a vastly different global landscape than his first. It's led some to question if his America First messaging could permanently change geopolitics.
And we begin a brand new day of American strength and prosperity, dignity and pride.
Described as both powerful and reckless, Donald Trump's political style has many leaders bracing for the unexpected. His supporters hope his transactional deal-making approach will help maintain the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, as well as end the fighting between Russia and Ukraine.
I haven't spoken to Trump in more than 4 years, and I am ready for it, of course, at any time. I will be ready for a meeting if he wants it.
Threats of U.S. tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China are worrying other countries, including longtime allies.
I think Europe needs to assert itself with regard to US trade policies and perhaps impose tariffs. It should also seek other trade partners outside the US and strengthen its own policies within the European Union.
Mass deportations are at the top of Trump's agenda. He's promised to tighten border security and deport up to 20 million undocumented immigrants from the U.S. Whether respected or feared, critics say Trump's blanket approach to legitimate issues, domestic and international, could have far-reaching consequences.
It would be a mistake for us to assume that the damage to the human rights system and to human rights as a whole will be domestic, because the tone that the US and that Trump in particular has been setting is one that is emboldening other autocrats or want-to-be autocrats around the world.
At a time of political uncertainty, many are wondering if Trump will upend more than 80 years of American dominance around the world, and if so, how much it will affect a shifting global order. Katia Lopez-Horayan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Dublin is Scott Lucas, a professor of US and international politics at University College Dublin. In Beijing is Ina Tangen, a senior fellow at Taipei Institute, that's an independent Chinese think tank. And in Colchester in the UK is Natasha Linstead, a foreign policy specialist and a professor of government at the University of Essex. A very warm welcome to all of you. We have a lot to get through in this program. Scott, I'll start with you. Trump, in his first few days as the next president, is expected to unleash a blitz of executive orders, actions including mass deportations, pardons for January 6 rioters, aggressive tariffs on a number of countries. His former White House Chief of Staff, Steve Bannon, said the concept for those first few days or weeks will be days of thunder. What are you expecting?
Well, think you summarized it well in the introduction when you talked about Donald Trump's first term being marked by chaos, and that is where we are 8 years later. In terms of specific actions, you are talking about the threat of those mass deportations, which will probably start tomorrow. There won't be millions deported immediately, but you will have the beginning of cutting the rights, limiting the ability of migrants and asylum seekers to be able to use the U.S. system to avoid deportation. You will see unleashing American fossil fuel companies by stripping regulations, with the effects that that will have on efforts to deal with climate change. You will see the cutting back, the stripping of women's rights, LGBT rights. And in terms of the foreign arena, we wait and see whether tariffs will be announced on day one. But there's the specific issue of up to 60% tariffs on China, which is balanced by the fact that Donald Trump is a great admirer of Xi Jinping and is making nice noises about him. We'll see if there are tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which is not balanced by the fact that Donald Trump hates Justin Trudeau in Canada and that the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has said she's not going to be bullied by him. And of course, that wider issue, which may not be in an executive order today, which is Donald Trump is not a friend of NATO. He is not a friend of the EU. He would like to disrupt those organizations. And to give you what is there beyond the headline of the executive orders, it wasn't just Donald Trump, but it was Marco Rubio who said this week that the post-war international order is obsolete. That order that you talked about since World War II that has tried to guarantee peace and security, and for this Trump administration, it no longer applies, which means the rest of the world will have to decide whether it wants to maintain that order in the face of the challenge, even the threat of Donald Trump.
Aina, how do you think China, where you are, but indeed the rest of the world, is looking ahead to the second Trump presidency? And what do you think leaders there and beyond have learned about how to deal with this president?
Well, quite frankly, you have to remember this is 8 years later, and the world is not the same. Donald Trump is coming into a situation where China has, in essence, prepared itself for these kind of shock and awe proceedings. But, it's odd. Within China itself, in Beijing, they're cautiously optimistic. They were very concerned about Biden's ideological bent, his desire to push the envelope, especially with Taiwan, and also the South China Seas, all of these areas. So they're looking forward to seeing what he has to offer. I mean, he has 200 proclamations and executive orders he's going to sign. Everybody's anxious to see. We all know the areas that were, mentioned by the professor, but we don't know the specifics and how deep it's going to go. There is some feeling here that the reason he called Xi Jinping was in part to, show that he's one of the boys, that he's one of the powerful people in the world, but also because he's been told that 60% tariffs on China would be disastrous in terms of the American public. They're tired of inflation. They don't want higher prices. So I think he's positioning himself where he says, well, I'm good friends with Xi, so I'm going to give him a chance. I'm going to only put, another 10 or 20% tariffs on China and then threaten to escalate it. And hope that this can somehow not cause too much of a problem in the U.S. I think it will, though.
Yeah, and Natasha, that is something he's known for, isn't it? To go big with the threats as a negotiation technique and then to, negotiate from that position. And as Scott was saying, as we've heard from Aina, he's had this conversation with Xi Jinping, and it seems that perhaps he will not impose 60% tariffs on China as he was threatening. He invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. How are you seeing things from the perspective of the great promises he made about how much he was going to improve the U.S. economy? Will the promises that he made actually improve the U.S. economy or the global economy?
So one of the things to understand about Trump is a lot of the things that come out of his mouth, they just sort of come into his head spontaneously sometimes. Sometimes he's just talking in order to distract from another scandal. I think one example of that is the way he started talking about annexing Greenland and attacking Panama. And that seemed to come out of nowhere, particularly the case with Panama. And this coincided with a release of a report by Special Counsel Jack Smith. So some of the things that he says, it is really more a distraction tool. Some of it is about negotiating, and he thinks when he can disarm and destabilize his opponents, in many cases his opponents are actually his allies, that he's going to have the upper hand in some kind of battle to negotiate better deals. But I think it's going to be very difficult for him to follow through with all of the things that he says he's going to do. Even with the power of executive order, there will be pressure not to go ahead with the extremes, like 60% tariffs on China, understanding how damaging that will be, really more so to the U.S. economy, because China will find other trading partners and had already diversified its economy during the first Trump administration. But if he really wants to address inflation, if Trump is really serious about that, having an additional tax on all these really critical and important goods coming in, whether it be from Canada, from Mexico, or China, and those are obviously the three biggest trading partners of the U.S., is not going to make things cheaper. And those were some of his big promises. So I don't think he can fully follow through on most of it. I think he wants, though, a photo op. I think he wants the appearance that he made a good deal, and he'll try to sell it that way to his base.
Scott, one of the things that he has achieved, one of the big things that he spoke about on the campaign trail, is he said he wanted a ceasefire in Gaza before his inauguration. That's something that has happened. Do you think that he will care about what happens in Gaza beyond the first phase of this deal when the Israeli captives have been exchanged?
We need to put that important question into perspective by going back to what really happened. And that is that soon after the November election, Joe Biden invited Donald Trump to the White House beyond the photo opportunity, because Biden, like everybody else, knows that you play to Trump in terms of his ego. And as a transactional president, he said, look, let's get a deal done by the time you step up and take the inaugural oath on January 20th. And to Trump's credit, because it would make him look good, he appointed or designated Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, to work with the Biden people. And of course, they, working with the Egyptians, the Qataris, brokering between Hamas and Israel, got us this phase one ceasefire, which we should have had many months ago. But be that as it may, what that story about Trump claiming credit all to himself obscures the fact is that we are unlikely at this point to get a phase two ceasefire. And why is that? Because the biggest determinant right now in phase two is not Donald Trump, it's Israeli domestic politics. And when you have two hard right ministers in the Israeli cabinet, one of whom has left and taken his party out of the government, when they're saying that Israel must return to war in 6 weeks and must establish a military government over Gaza, it's going to be very hard for Benjamin Netanyahu to proceed with phase two, even if he wanted to. So what does Donald Trump and his envoy Steve Witkoff do then when they hit the hard truth about Israeli politics versus the absolute devastation in Gaza and the fact that Hamas does not want to relinquish power?
And Ina, does it give us an idea, to answer Scott's question about what Donald Trump might do if we look at everyone that he has put in place to work on his Middle East policy, supports Netanyahu? Of course, what happens with this war has an impact on the entire region and beyond. If you look at his appointees so far, support Netanyahu. His Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth thinks Israel should annex the West Bank. Does that tell us everything we need to know about what we can expect? Or is Trump still capable of surprises here, do you think, Ina?
Well, Elizabeth, I don't think there are any surprises. What he wanted was a show pony. He wanted to have his inauguration and say, look, I brought peace into Israel and Hamas. The fact is, they have already started a position where they say, well, if Hamas breaks the truce, all hands are off. I mean, his idea is he would like to see peace there, not because he particularly cares about the situation. He's a big backer of Israel, but he would like to get the Nobel Peace Prize. He nominated or got people to nominate him twice during his last presidency. And he said many times on the campaign trail, I'm going to be the peace president and things like this. remember, Obama got it, and anything that Obama had, he seems to want. So that might be an amelioration in terms of his action, but I doubt it. I would agree with the former speaker. This is a situation which domestic politics in Israel is going to control. He's just looking for some way to say, well, I tried, I brought them together, and then, these terrible Hamas people broke the deal, and, Israel's going to have to take care of it.
Natasha, as well as saying that he wanted a ceasefire before the inauguration, one of the things he repeated during the campaign was that he would end the Russia-Ukraine war in a day. Interestingly, he stopped saying that, and he said that it would take him perhaps the first 100 days to secure a deal. Of course, Washington has great leverage with Kyiv because of the military support it provides Ukraine. How do you see Trump using that leverage?
Well, I don't think that he has any control over when the war ends in Ukraine. I know that he said, as you mentioned, 24 hours, and he backed out on that. And he's already admitted in his interview with Time magazine that this conflict is far more complicated than the conflict in the Middle East, which we, of course, know is incredibly complicated as well. And the reason why he cannot resolve the issue in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine is because Russia wants to control all of Ukraine. They are not going to be willing to accept some sort of deal, even if Ukraine is forced to capitulate quite a bit of territory. And in fact, the Keith Kellogg deal, and Keith Kellogg is the special envoy that Trump's going to appoint for Ukraine and Russia, that deal wasn't really even official, but the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, has already rejected that deal and says that it doesn't meet Russia's requirements. So unless Trump wants Ukraine to completely fall to Russia, and that may be too embarrassing for his administration, I think he's going to find it difficult to get some kind of deal that both sides can agree to. And already the deal that he had put forward to Russia was one that was incredibly favorable to Russia.
Right. Scott and Ina, either of you can take this question. Is it possible for Trump to break such an impasse when Putin won't accept ceding the territory that he has seized in this war? And even though Zelensky has said for the first time that he might be open to freezing the war along the current front lines, that would only be if the rest of Ukraine could join NATO, which Trump has said he understands why Ukraine joining NATO would be unacceptable to Russia.
Well, Donald Trump knows less than my mom does about Ukraine. She's 86 years old. And more importantly, Donald Trump is beholden to Vladimir Putin. He's been beholden to Vladimir Putin since 2016 when the Russians helped his campaign, and since Putin flattered him and continues to flatter him. Now, and Donald Trump wants to say, I am the peacemaker, et cetera, et cetera. The question here is the people around Trump. And that is, you have to look, as Natasha mentioned, to Keith Kellogg, the envoy. You have to look to Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, possibly Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And that is, will they, like Trump, just simply accept the Kremlin narrative of peace talks, which means annexation, the international community of accepting the annexation by Russia of 27% of Ukraine? Or will they say, no, we're not going to let Vladimir Putin have that? There is a deal which is pretty much being worked out, which is being developed, which is going to be that in the short term, Ukraine will accept the Russian occupation of parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, including Crimea. And in return, Ukraine will get a path to NATO and get a path to the European Union. But you've got to square a lot of people to accept that. You've got to square European countries on that. You've got to arrange that with NATO, of course. And you've also got to look at powers like China's in terms of how they're going to react. So no, Trump's not going to bring a settlement to Ukraine because Trump here is simply all bluster. The question is, will Washington have enough adults in the room to be able to deal with this and not capitulate to effectively being carrying water for the Kremlin?
And Ina, will, the international community saying that further annexation is not acceptable, but the international community will not fill the military shortfall to Ukraine that Donald Trump can withhold, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, Ukraine is losing the war. I mean, that's not something conjecture. It's just the way it is. But, Putin can't really expand to all of Ukraine. He would be facing a hardened opposition that would go guerrilla on him. He'd have to have a massive amount of resources there to garrison a very, very large part of the country. So, what Putin wants is he wants to keep the territory that he's in essence annexed, and he wants it clear that the rest of Ukraine is going to remain neutral, that you're not going to have U.S. missiles there. He doesn't want an open sore, an unresolved situation. So it's going to be very difficult to solve. But in terms of my colleague's point about Washington, look, let's be real about this. What we're looking at is the 5th season of The Apprentice, Washington. Look at the people he's put on. They're not qualified, but they certainly are photogenic, and they're also expendable. So he's going to assign them tasks. If they don't, aren't able to respond, or if they defy him, they're gone. I don't think he'll do the "you're fired" bit, but Ramaswamy is already gone, and he hasn't even started his tenure as president. This is the way it's going to go. He's going to manage Washington like he managed The Apprentice. It's going to be a bit of a show, but he's always paying attention to the polls, and anything that slides against him, he's going to pivot. As I said, there's no ideology here.
Yeah, Natasha, what do you make of what Einar is saying, that there is no ideology binding the people that he's brought together? In fact, the only thing that looks like what these people might have in common is a loyalty to Trump.
That's exactly what's happened. I mean, he's become more personalistic, similar to personalist dictators that I study, that he doesn't really want to surround himself by those that are competent and that have a lot of experience. He prefers fealty, total loyalty. And that's really different than the first administration, where there were some guardrails up. There were some people that worked in his administration that had experience and that told him no or steered him to do, quote unquote, the right thing from time to time. But because he's surrounded himself by these sycophants, this is going to affect, of course, the quality of intelligence. It's going to affect the decisions that he's making. And we're going to see a U.S. increasingly isolated with very little respect for international law and international institutions. And
Scott, human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, have all been sounding the alarm about what the second Trump presidency will mean for not just human rights, women's rights in the US, but around the world. I mean, Trump has joked that he would be a dictator on day one, but given how he's governed in the past, do you think he's really joking?
Donald Trump's a wannabe autocrat. He admires those who not only flatter him, but those who happen to be autocrats, whether it's Xi Jinping, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, whether it's Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And Donald Trump does not believe in working within the system. He sees the American system as being a threat to him. And he sees human rights as being a threat to him. I mean, let's remember a couple things here. To connect the personal with what's happening in terms of foreign policy. Donald Trump's a convicted felon. Donald Trump's also a convicted fraudster. Donald Trump has been convicted of defamation of a woman who he sexually assaulted. So rights don't enter into what Donald Trump does personally. And he doesn't think of rights when he looks at America or abroad. And of course, the tragedy here is that America, which is, of course, has been very flawed in the way that it has tried to promote human rights. We could go talk about decades about that. But what happens here is if you have a president who absolutely is not only against human rights, but is tearing them apart, then those who are in other countries around the world who are suppressing human rights, whether it be in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, they feel like they've got a free pass. There's no reason to listen to the United States on this issue.
Yeah. Aina, how do you see it? Because the US has long been criticized for not being completely genuine when it talks about holding up human rights and the rules-based order. What does having someone like Donald Trump in the presidency mean for the US role in that?
Well, unfortunately, the unvarnished truth is that the United States has been a rogue nation for most of its life. It's only been at peace for 17 years out of 249. And it's not that much of a change. Remember, under Biden, the Pentagon was spreading this nonsense about the Chinese vaccines in the Philippines. This cost many people their lives. And when they were confronted by it, by Reuters, what did they say? Oh, we do it again because it's a way of getting back at China. They did the same thing with the fake vaccine drive when they were hunting for Osama bin Laden. What has the result been? Anybody who claims that they're vaccinating, even for polio, is being attacked and killed. I mean, there are long-term consequences to this pretending that the U.S. is the benefactor of the world. They're not. Guantanamo has not been closed. What do you say about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places? Somalia, you name it. The U.S. has been a bringer of chaos. It has not been upholding the international order. It has been ignoring it. Remember, under Biden, the ICC is being threatened with arrest.
But I suppose the question is, does it have a leader who can undo some of that damage? Or, Natasha, let me put it to you, how much more damage will the Trump presidency do to that, keeping in mind that this has to be his last term?
Right. I mean, so I would counter that Biden was trying to move back towards multilateral diplomacy. To what extent he was successful, people can debate that. But under the Trump administration, it will get worse. I mean, to quote a Harvard law professor, Jack Goldsmith, during Trump's first term, we've never seen such an onslaught on international institutions and international law, because he just doesn't understand the way international politics works. He doesn't have any moral authority. He lies more frequently than he tells the truth. And all these things coupled together with just the fact that also he sees his allies as the problem and not his necessarily U.S.'s traditional enemies is going to make it much more difficult. And when the U.S. has been at its most democratic, that actually does affect the level of democracy across the world. There is this diffusion effect that you see higher respect for human rights, and stronger electoral institutions and levels of participation and representation. So it does really matter what the U.S. is doing, but I think Trump is going to plunge things on a very dangerous path.
Natasha Lindsted in Colchester, Scott Lucas in Dublin, and Ina Tangen in Beijing. I'm afraid we'll run out of time, but I want to thank you all for this lively discussion. We really appreciate your time. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Chapter 7. The House on the Hill. The man smelled. I could smell him from the other side of my office when he came in. Mr. Jules Amthor's driver. He gave me one of Mr. Amthor's cards, but I'd seen one before, in a more interesting place. He also gave me $100 from Mr. Amthor. That was interesting. I locked the office, and the man drove me over to Stillwood Heights, getting green lights all the way. Some guys are lucky like that. We drove up a long driveway with bright red flowers down the sides and stopped in front of a large, lonely house right on top of the hill. The man opened the door for me, and I got out. He led me into the house, into a lift where his smell was even worse than before, and up. There was a desk with a woman behind it when we stopped and the doors opened. She was the owner of the voice on the telephone. I gave her the $100. Sorry. It was a nice thought, but I can't take this. I have to know what the job is before I take any money for it. She nodded, stood up, and pressed a button on the wall. A hidden door opened noiselessly and closed again after I'd gone through it without her. There was nobody in the dark room I was now in. I stood for 30 seconds, wondering if someone was watching me. Then another door opened quietly on the other side of the room, and a tall, thin, straight man in a black suit walked in quickly and sat down on a chair by a table in the middle of the room. "How can I help you?" he asked. His eyes, deep and very black, seemed to look at me without seeing me, without feeling anything. "You seem to forget why I came," I said. "By the way, I gave that $100 back to your secretary. I wanted to know why your card was found in the pocket of a dead man last night." His face didn't change. "There are things I do not know," he said after a second or two, "and this is one of them. Anybody can take one of my cards." I almost believed him. Almost, but not quite. "Then why did you send me $100? I asked. "My dear Mr. Marlowe," he said coldly, "I am not a fool. I am in a difficult business, always in danger from doctors who do not believe in my work as a psychiatrist. I like to know why people are asking questions about me." So I told him the whole story of my meeting with Marriott and about Marriott's murder. Nothing changed in his face. Then I had another idea. I asked, "Do you know a Mrs. Grail, too, by any chance?" He did. She had seen him about some problem once. That's what I liked about this job. Everyone knew everyone. Marriott, Grail, and now Amthor. I was sitting there feeling pleased with myself when suddenly all the lights went out. The room was as dark as death. I kicked my chair back and stood up, but it was no good. I was too slow. I smelled the man behind me just before he took me by the throat and lifted me into the air. I stopped breathing. The only good thing about that was that I couldn't smell him anymore. A voice said softly, "Let him breathe. A little." The fingers round my throat loosened, and I fought my way free from them just in time for something hard to hit me on the mouth. I tasted blood. The voice said, "Get him on his feet. Stupid man. I think he can stand on his own now." The lights went on again, and the arms dropped away. I stood, shaking my head, trying to think straight. Then I went for the smile on Amthor's face with everything I had in my right arm. It wasn't too bad. I hit the smile straight in the middle. Amthor looked surprised, very angry, and hurt. Suddenly, there was a gun in his hand. "Sit down, fool," he said, pointing it at me. Blood was coming out of his nose. I sat down near the table. Suddenly, everything in my head went black. Maybe I went to sleep, just like that, with the nasty thin man in the black suit pointing his gun at me. I wasn't too sure when I thought about it later. When I woke up, I was in a small room with white walls and no window. My throat felt as if someone had jumped on it, and I couldn't see clearly. It was as if there was smoke in front of my eyes, filling the room. I was in a bed. I began to remember things. Amthor and the man who smelled. Breaking Amthor's nose. That made me feel better. But then they must have given me some sort of drug to knock me out, or to make me talk, and now I was having a hard time coming out of it. I sat up on the bed and put my feet on the floor. I started to walk across the little room. It wasn't easy. It was as if I had drunk too much. But slowly the smoke started to clear from in front of my eyes. I walked and walked and walked round the room, with my knees shaking, but my head getting clearer all the time. There was a bottle of whiskey on a small table in one corner, but it smelled funny. More drugs in it, maybe, so I didn't take a drink. But I could use it another way. I picked it up, went over to the door, and shouted, "Fire! Fire!" Steps came running. A key was pushed into the lock, and the door jumped open. I was flat against the wall to one side, and I hit him with the bottle as he came in. A small, square, strong man in a white coat. Another friendly psychiatrist, maybe. He was out cold on the floor, with funny-smelling whiskey and pieces of broken bottle all over him. I went through his pockets and took his keys. Then I tied him to the bed with his white coat. One of his keys opened the cupboard in the corner of the room, and all my clothes were in there. So was my gun, but someone had kindly taken all the bullets out of it. I locked the man in the room and went quietly across the carpet, listening to the silence of the house and holding the empty gun in front of me. There was an open door with a light on in the room, just in front of me. I heard a man cough. Very carefully, I looked into the room. He was reading a newspaper. I could only see the side of his face. He needed a shave. But Mr. Moose Malloy was having a nice, comfortable time hiding in this place, wherever it was. It was time for me to get out, though, to go far away, fast. So I left him there and moved quietly on. I walked on quietly through the empty house, past rooms with white walls and medicine bottles and metal tables with instruments on them. I saw a clock which told me it was almost midnight, but I didn't meet any of the lovely people who worked in the place. At last, I came to the front door. It wasn't locked. I walked out into the night. It was a cool night, no moon. The house was on the corner of a street. The sign said Descanso Street. I started to walk as fast as I could, listening for the scream of police cars coming to take me back there. But nothing happened. I knew I was somewhere near the address Anne Reardon had told me for her apartment, at 819 25th Street. I worked my way across the streets towards it, and then realized I was still holding my gun in my hand. I put it away fast and kept on walking. The fresh air helped. I started to feel a bit better. The light was still on at number 819, so I rang the bell. A voice from behind the door said, "Who is it?" "Marlowe." The door opened, and Anne Reardon stood there looking at me. Her eyes went wide and frightened. "My God," she cried, "you look like a ghost." Chapter 8. Brains Behind the Business. I was half sitting and half lying in a deep chair in her comfortable living room with its pleasant furniture and curtains. Anne sat opposite, her eyes dark and full of worry. She had made me 3 cups of black coffee and 2 eggs with some toast, and I had told her some of the story, but not all of it. I had not told her the bit about Moose Malloy. "Amthor's a nasty, hard guy," I said, "but I don't think he's clever enough to be the brains of the Jewel gang. Perhaps I'm wrong, but my guess is that I wouldn't have got out of his little hospital if he was boss of a gang like that. I'd be dead."
"But he's frightened of something, isn't he? He doesn't like the questions you're asking."
I nodded. I think Marriott carried Amthor's card in his pocket that night exactly because he wanted it to be found if anything happened to him. So we know that the jewel robbery had something to do with Marriott's murder, and I'm beginning to think Amthor had something to do with the jewel robbery. But I don't think he's the top man. Her smile was warm, but as sharp as a razor at the same time.
"I forgot you were such a great detective. You get blood all over your face, you get yourself locked up in a hospital for 2 days, shot full of drugs, and after all that, you arrive at the most obvious answer. Wonderful."
I stood up. "Yeah, I'm a little slow and tired tonight. Would you be kind enough to drive me to a taxi stand? I need a good night's sleep so that I can think out a better answer. And I don't want to stay anywhere too near those guys in that hospital. People around there don't seem to like me too much." She went quiet.
"You could stay here and—"
"You promise you'll lock your door?" She went red and stood up.
"Sometimes I think you're the greatest thing I've ever seen, and sometimes I think you're the worst, the lowest. You're sick."
She walked out of the room fast and came back with her coat on, her red hair looking as angry as her face. She drove me all the way home, silent and angry, and when she dropped me at the door of my apartment, she said goodbye in a frozen voice. She drove away before I had my keys out of my pocket. In the morning, I felt a lot better. My head still hurt and my tongue still felt dry and sticky inside my mouth, but I'd known worse mornings. My left foot felt fine. It didn't hurt at all. So I kicked the corner of the bed with it on my way to the bathroom. I was just calling myself some very rude names when there was a loud knock on the door. Police Detective Randall stood there. Brown suit, hat, very clean and tidy, and a nasty look in his eye. He pushed the door and I stood back. He came in and looked around. "Where have you been, Marlowe? Wanted to talk to you." "I've been sick, in a hospital." I lit a cigarette. "And I haven't had my morning coffee yet. I'm not feeling too friendly." "I thought I told you to keep out of this investigation. Leave it alone, didn't I? I could make trouble for you, but I haven't. You know why?" "Yeah, you couldn't find me." Very slowly, he took a packet of cigarettes from his pocket, trying to control himself. His hand was shaking when he lit his match. I went out to the kitchen to make some coffee. He didn't like that either, but he followed me out. "This Jewel gang has been around Hollywood for the last 10 years, he said. "This time they went too far. Killed a man. I think I know why." I got the cream from the refrigerator, poured 2 cups of coffee, and we sat down. "Was that a joke about being in hospital?" he asked. "No. I ran into some trouble over at Stillwood Heights, and some kind people put me in a hospital just over the line in Bay City. Place for drink and drugs problems. Nice little place. Shot me full of drugs and kept me there for 2 days until I woke up and walked out to see a friend." "Bay City," he said. "Man named Jules Amthor? Why'd you take that card, Marlowe? You should have told me about it. You see, your friend over in Bay City, the redhead, she told me. She likes you. She was hoping to get you out of a tight corner with me. Her father was a police officer, remember?" "Ah, hell. Trying to help me. Nice girl. Not my type, though." He smiled his first smile of the day. He probably only let himself have 4 smiles a day. I could see he didn't believe me, so I went on. "This is what I think, if it's any use to you, Randall. I think Marriott was a blackmailer of rich women. Mrs. Grail told me so. But I think he was also the finger man for the Jewel gang, the boy who could point them in the right direction, tell them where the really expensive pieces were, and exactly when and where to move in on his lady friends when he took them out to dinner. You see, in this Grail robbery, Marriott had taken Mrs. Grail to the Trocadero, and he was driving the car on their way home. He could choose the streets they took, and the gang could follow. I think they killed Marriott because people were starting to put 2 and 2 together about him, and the answer was 4. He wasn't useful to them anymore, so this was his last job for them. But Marriott guessed something was going wrong and got frightened. He asked me to go along with him, and he had the little trick of Amthor's card in his pocket. He was trying to show us who the real brains behind the business were. A guy quite nasty enough and clever enough, and also a guy who could get information about rich women when they came to talk to him about their problems. A very friendly psychiatrist. And Marriott's trick with Amthor's card worked, too, didn't it? "I think your ideas about Marriott may be right," he said. "But you haven't told me the whole story, everything you know, have you, Marlowe? Marriott had $23,000 in the bank. That's a lot of money. But there's also the little matter of that nice house he owned up on West 54th Place, number 1644. That interest you at all?" He picked up a spoon and started to turn it in his hand. I didn't answer, just looked at him. He went on. You see, I can put two and two together as well, Marlowe. And that brings a large ex-prisoner called Moose Malloy into the picture, doesn't it? I'm listening, I said. So I called up Detective Nolte, who I hear is investigating that one, and he told me you were trying to find a girl called Velma something, Malloy's girl. He said you'd been to see a woman by the name of Jessie Florian, and her address was, guess where, 1644 West 54th Place, the place Marriott owned. So here I am early this sunny morning, asking you a few questions, and you're not helping me much. I went over to my jacket, hanging on the back of a chair. I wondered if they'd taken my two photos out at the hospital place, but they were both still there. The one of Velma Valento from Mrs. Florian's box, and the one of Mrs. Grail, which Anne Reardon had given me. I gave the one of Velma to Randall first. He studied it carefully. Then I put the one of Mrs. Grail next to it. He looked at it and nodded. For $20 million, I'd marry her myself, he said. There's another thing I ought to tell you, I said. This hospital I was in, down on Descanso in Bay City. They're running a hiding place for gangsters there, too. I saw Moose Malloy there last night, in a room. Randall sat very still, watching me. Sure? He asked. I didn't make a mistake, I said, even though I was full of drugs. It was him, all right. He stood up. Let's go and see this Mrs. Florian together, you and me. I told him everything I knew about this business while we were on our way.